Hello and welcome to this week's Washed Ashore podcast. The tables have been turned slightly with this episode, and I will be presenting, and my colleague Charlotte, who's with me on the line, will be in the hot seat. Hello, Charlotte.
This feels a bit weird. I
I
don't
know
like this.
it's a change in the format, to be honest.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're mixing it up a bit. Ooh.
yeah, I know. I must admit, it's a bit weird presenting it, to be honest. Yeah. So,
Well, I'm trusting you for one episode, Max. If you mess this up, you never do it again.
I'll never be asked again.
No.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. This is a good trial then.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So all of this week, for those of you that may have listened to our previous podcast, we are celebrating and exploring the unknown. We're looking at maritime mysteries. We're looking at chilling tales, and we are exploring some of those in these podcasts. So last week I gave mine on the Birkenhead disaster, the HMS Birkenhead, and this week Charlotte has got another absolute cracker. So I think I will pass over to Charlotte. Charlotte, is viewer discretion advised?
I think viewer discretion is advised. This is not for small children or the
Okay,
faint-hearted, but
good.
I'm going to try and keep it light.
Nice. Okay. Okay. I think legally that covers us.
Yes,
So
I
that's
think we're
fine.
fine now. Yeah,
That's fine. I
you
will
have
hand over
been
to you
warned.
then. I will
Great.
hand over to Charlotte then.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, so I've gone for a slightly different chilling tale, and I've gone for the mysterious or sort of not so mysterious murders of three passengers on the Herbert Fuller in 1896. So I was kind of drawn to this story partly because of my interest in true crime, not gonna lie, but also I find it sort of it's quite a strange thing that when you're on a ship, be it a passenger or crew, you're you almost have to implicitly trust everyone else you're with, because that's it for wherever you're going for however long. Those are the people that you're with. You can't really escape unless you jump in the sea or into the ocean or wherever else. But that's it. So if something happened, like a murder, um, or anything else, would you be found? Would anything else happen? And I find that quite a terrifying thought to have. So not putting anyone off going on ships, but I'm still going to explore the murder of three people on the Herbert Fuller. So it is quite a long and complex story. It's had many versions due to the witnesses on the ship. So I've condensed it down a bit. But if you are interested in the story, I do implore you to look it up because it is fascinating. So the Herbert Fuller was built in 1890. She was not classed by Lloyd's Register, but she does appear in the register book. So in July 1896. The Herbert Fuller left Boston with 11 people on board, and the journey was to carry lumber to Argentina. So the people on board were primarily crew. There was Captain Nash, his wife Laura, and the second mate Bloomberg, and then the sort of other key players was the only pleasure passenger on board, Lester Monks, the a fellow sailor called Justus Westerberg, but he was known as Charlie Brown. He was a Swedish sailor, and Thomas Bram, who was the first mate. So those six are really kind of the key players in all of this. As I said, the destination was Argentina, but they never made it. 18 days later, they turned up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, flying the black distress signal. When they arrived, the bodies were uncovered. Apparently, they were wrapped in white shrouds, which were soaked with slime, salt water, blood, and decaying matter. And crowds inevitably gathered to try and see the bodies. So, what happened between leaving Boston and then arriving in Halifax? No one is 100% certain, so I'm just going to go through a rough idea of the sort of series of events. So on the night of July 13th to the 14th, Captain Nash, his wife, and Bloomberg had been murdered with an axe. So they were found murdered in the night with an axe. So you would think that given the fact that these murders took place on a ship, and not only that, the ship didn't really have many people on board, 11 left, you would believe that the suspects would be easily identified. Of the 11 that were on the ship, the only ones that, did not arrive in Halifax were the 3 that had died. So everyone else was still there. So no one had jumped overboard, no one had gotten away. So why couldn't they, find exactly who done it? Yeah. So we're going to take each of the sort of suspects, the 3 main suspects, individually. So Monks, as I said, Monks was the only pleasure passenger on the ship. He was a Harvard student, and when they arrived in Halifax, because of his standing as a Harvard student, he was allowed a little more luxury and was able to tell his story first, pretty much. So he kind of goes through his version of events. Now, the reason he had been on the ship in the first place was that he had been advised by his doctor to go to sea and take in the sea air. And it was aimed to help him with his drinking problem. It was not likely to help with his drinking problem because in his cargo, it was found that he had a bottle of whiskey, a bottle of brandy, and 60 bottles of beer.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, well done, doctor. Send him to sea.
I mean, he was there for pleasure, so.
Well, exactly. Not for his health, apparently.
Yeah, of course.
So Monks said, this is his version of events, that he had awoken from his sleep, he'd gone to bed about 11 o'clock at night, awoken from his sleep about 1 o'clock in the morning to Mrs. Nash's screams, so the captain's wife. He grabbed his revolver, put on his trousers, that's key, apparently, and went to investigate. And as he passed the captain's chart room, he saw the captain dying on the floor. So then at this moment, he was confronted by the first mate, Bram. And because Monks was holding his revolver, Bram was sort of assumed that he had shot everyone and was, oh my God, don't shoot me. And Monks said, no. I'm putting the gun down, don't worry. I didn't shoot anyone, this is just for protection. Bram, and then they found, that people had been murdered, and the captain sort of drew his last breath. Apparently he was found having been hacked with an axe, but he was still kind of gurgling for breath.
God.
Yeah. So all hands were called, and a conversation was had between, everyone who was on the ship, and it was decided that a chap called Brown was the guilty party, who we'll come to a bit later. Anyway, Monks sort of almost took charge a little bit, ordered that Brown be put in irons, and then when he arrived in Halifax, he told his story. And this was, he went through his story, this is what happened. But it seemed that there were too many questions and contradictions that came out of his version of events. It transpired that he did not put his trousers on. Whether he did or didn't, who knows? He said that they, when the murders had happened, they were going to go straight back to Boston, but actually Boston was never an option. They'd come too far out. They had to either, the only place they could get to quick enough was Halifax, Nova Scotia. So him saying, we were trying to get back to Boston, that wasn't the case. He was also, so Monks after the murders wrote in the logbook about what happened, and he was able to quote word for word what he had written in the logbook, which seems a bit strange. He was also adamant that it was either Brown or Bram, and really focused on them. One thing that also kind of stuck out to reporters, because he was quite happy to talk to the press and embellish everything, was that how the murderer could kill 3 people, pretty much, without waking Monks up when he was next door in his room next door. And he only wakes up to the screams of Mrs. Nash, but apparently 2 people were already dead or dying. Because, if you think about this was a relatively small ship, The walls would have been thin. You would have been quite confined below deck. You would think you would hear something if someone's been murdered with an axe. Mm.
You'd think so.
You would think so. I would
Yeah.
think so. Um, so in his stories to the press as well, he made this big thing about how on his way to board the ship in Boston, he was suddenly sort of struck with the idea of buying a revolver, and he did. And then it apparently transpired that he already had the revolver. It was a present from his uncle. So it was all these sorts of things with Monks where I think he was trying to make himself out to be the hero, but he's a bit suspicious. Anyway, he was sort of held in custody, but his father, his uncle, and his lawyer all came up to Halifax, and he was cleared. Then he was accompanied to the ship with his father and uncle and took his belongings. His belongings were never examined. So there was never really anything further investigated. He never went for proper questioning. He was kind of just, okay, that was your account. Oh, well, you're sort of from a wealthy family. You go to Harvard. It can't be you. Off you go. So that was Monks. Now we have Brown. Now, Brown was initially picked as the suspect, as I said. He was at the wheel that night. He was on duty until 1 in the morning. And he was relieved at 1 in the morning by a chap called Noheck. And yeah, so that was kind of what he was doing. He was at the wheel. So Brown said that when he was at the wheel, he had seen Bram go into the cabins. That was his story. However, others sort of didn't really believe him. They kind of thought that what he had done actually was stand at the wheel and then attach the wheel somehow to something else so that the ship was still steering, go into the cabins, murder everyone, come back to the wheel and carry on. Which seems a little bit extreme. But Brown's background was that in Holland, he had been arrested for murder, but he was let go because he pleaded insane. And he had been held in a hospital, and in this hospital, apparently he was once awoken and then shot a pistol because he'd been woken up. So he was a bit unstable. But there was no real reason as to why he would kill the captain's wife, or the second mate. So it was a bit of an odd one, I think, because they knew he was a little bit mad. Maybe they thought he was, the guilty party. So he was put in handcuffs or whatever it was, chained up, and there he stayed for the rest of the voyage. So then we have Bram. Now, as I said, Brown apparently saw Bram go into the cabins and killed them. The interesting thing is, if Brown had seen that, he didn't tell anyone else. So when he was relieved, and then when he went to see the lookout, he didn't tell anyone that I'd seen Bram go in and do something weird in the cabins. So maybe he didn't see Bram go in. Anyway, Bram, as I said, he came upon Monks, and they both kind of tried to figure out what happened, blamed Brown. Brown said nothing. He didn't really go against it. He didn't mention to anyone about having seen Bram go into the cabins until they got to shore. He was apparently scared of the crew. So, yeah. You then have Bram. So Bram says to everyone on deck after the murders, don't blame the living for the dead. The dead cannot answer for themselves, which is quite a profound statement, to be honest. He believed that the captain killed his wife with the axe. Then Blomberg, the second mate, killed the captain. Then Blomberg killed himself, threw the axe onto the deck, and then took himself into another room to die. That was Bram's story. Then, as the kind of last part of the voyage carried on. They were at sea for about 7 days after the murders. Bran was eventually then accused as a suspect and was again sort of shackled. So when they came into Halifax, they had these two main suspects, plus Monks being a bit suspicious. So then the investigation unfolds, and you've got two chaps that have come up from Boston, Ingraham and Mr. Forbes, who Forbes happened to be Monks's lawyer. And then you also had a chap called Detective Power from Halifax. So you had these three investigating everything. Now this is when Brown comes out and said, I saw Bram go into the cabins. It was Bram. Bram says, he could not have seen me from the ship's wheel. And the investigators jumped on that comment because he kind of slipped up there. Well, I mean, some people say he slipped up, some people just think it was a general statement. But, couldn't have seen me from the ship's wheel. Then his criminal record came to light. So Bram had actually stolen cargo from a ship prior to this voyage, and apparently told a previous crewmate that if they killed the captain of the ship they were on, they could take the cargo and sell it. So he has a little bit more motive than Brown. Apparently he also said of Nash, the captain, here is a man who has a good wife and is not deserving of her. And then said, some other sport will dash his money up against the wall. So yeah, there's a little bit more motives there. So the attention goes towards Bram. Now, Detective Power of Halifax, he is a fascinating chap. And I do wonder if maybe he was the inspiration for Inspector Clouseau.
Inspector Clouseau.
Yeah. Wait till you hear about him. So Power thought of himself as this incredible detective. When he died, he was described as the most colourful police figure Canada had ever produced. But he also seemed to have it in for Americans. So in 1883, he arrested two Irish Americans who were planning to assassinate the future George V, who was on a yacht in the Halifax harbour. So when he found these two Irish Americans, the suspects did have dynamite and diving suits on them. Turned out they were coal miners off to work, which they would need dynamite and diving suits. And on another occasion, he thought two Americans had robbed a bank, but didn't bother to follow up with the bank manager who had just fled to England. So, though he thought of himself as this great detective, he was a bit hapless. But he was determined to, for once, find an American guilty, I think was his thing. So he focused everything on Bram and really believed that Bram did it. So all of the passengers and crew that had been on the ship were taken to Boston, and they were all under arrest. Monks was allowed a little bit more luxury, and when they got to Boston, he was free to go, but obviously he was called back as a witness. The other chap that was quite interesting on the ship was a man called Spencer, and he was the steward. He had done absolutely nothing wrong, and his version of events seemed to be a little bit more plausible than everyone else's, and he was seen as a bit of a hero of the story. The only problem was he was black and poor and not well connected, so he was still under arrest, unlike Monks who had all the connections. Eventually, Spencer was set free. He was absolutely fine in the end. So the trial goes ahead, and it was a sensational trial. Ultimately, Bram was convicted and sentenced to hang. But there was a procedural error, so he was granted a second trial, and this time he was not sentenced to death. So you might think that's where the story ends. Bram is convicted, he did it. Then a few years later, you have a woman called Mary Roberts Reinhardt, and she was an author, and she was looking for inspiration for her next book when she stumbled across the story of the Fuller murders. And this was sort of early 1910s. So she wrote a fictional account of the murders in her book The After House. But she decided to add a couple of twists. One, for poetic, artistic license, the ship was a yacht. She wanted it to be a bit more glamorous. But the other more interesting one was that she made Brown, not Bram, as the suspect and the one who was convicted.
Mm.
And this was because she did a little bit more investigating into Brown and found that he, after the trial, and obviously before, back in his time in Holland, he had frequent psychotic episodes that would also be quite violent. So she took that sort of that investigation, put it into the character in the book, and said that Brown committed the murders because he had mental delusions that led to killing sprees. So you'd think, okay, well, it's a fictional story, blah, blah, blah. However, a chap called Theodore Roosevelt, don't know if you've heard of him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that guy.
Rings a bell.
Yeah, not famous for a lot, really. He was a big fan of the book, and he was such a fan that he actually believed Bram in real life was innocent. So Bram was released from prison in 1913, but obviously then struggled to get a job. So Theodore Roosevelt petitioned Woodrow Wilson to pardon Bram, and the pardon was granted in 1919, meaning that Bram was able to carry on as a local businessman. And that is the very diluted story of the Herbert Fuller murders.
Wow. That is quite the story,
It's quite a story, yeah.
I was quite gripped. God. I don't even know where to begin. Yeah, it's. I mean, well, firstly, I mean, who's your money on?
Yeah, you see, I think I could see any of them doing it, to be honest. I think Monk's got off too easily, but I can't see why he would murder them.
Yeah, yeah.
I think Brown, he could have had a psychotic episode. But apparently he seems, when he was relieved from watch, he seems so calm that the person who relieved him didn't think of anything suspicious. So even if he had done it or if he'd seen someone do something suspicious, he didn't say anything. And then Bram had the most reason to do it, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't think everything was investigated fully. I should also say that the axe was found on the ship, but that it was thrown overboard because they thought they should get rid of it. And and another sort of point is that Brown, he was found wearing different clothes after the murders and threw his overalls overboard because they were covered in blood, and said that he didn't want to be seen as the murderer.
Right, okay.
So there's a lot of things that have gone overboard that would have been useful. Also, of course, the bodies were then moved, and they were put in a boat, a small boat that was then attached to the ship. So because they smelt so much, they wanted them off the ship.
Right, okay.
So they'd all been moved, and then they'd also been put together in this boat. So they become a sort of mess together, the three bodies. There are photographs of the murder scenes, and you can see a lot of them on at the Nova Scotia archives. They've been digitized as well. So it's really difficult to sort of actually fully understand what happened, and it's so sort of weird because, again, as I said, this is on a ship with 11 people.
Yeah.
The fact that no one really heard anything. That no one saw anything. It's quite a violent way to die as well. Triple axe murder.
It does sound like something that's that's obviously pulled straight from an Agatha Christie novel.
Yeah, this is
it's God, what? Yeah, what a great story. It's yeah. I mean, it's obviously it seems that there's so. I think what's quite unique about it as well is that it sounds like there was there was really sort of a certain degree of suspicion on all of them, or
Yes.
there at the very least there were questions that were unanswered about
Mm,
each of the main suspects,
mm,
but yeah, fascinating.
mm.
I mean, it's also not really one that I've heard very much about, to be honest, as well.
No.
It's an
I
interesting one.
think it is one of those that, yeah, it isn't necessarily a famous story. Possibly more famous in Nova Scotia and Boston. Apparently, the locals in Boston um, were wanting to partly rally around those that were from Boston that were innocent or
Mm,
victims, but then also were angry that, one of their own might have done this. So there was a bit of and then you obviously have that great detective up in Halifax that, is
yeah,
thinking this is his chance to shine, and ultimately he does in a way. He gets
yeah,
the guilty the guilty verdict, but is still alive when Bram is released. So I can only imagine he was sat there shaking his
God,
fist at the paper when he
yeah,
found out. So the fact that it kind of weaves in with all these sort of other stories that were going on at the time
mm,
is just, yeah, I've just found it absolutely fascinating. And I believe there was a book that came out this year, maybe about it.
mm.
So obviously there is more kind of going into the story of the Herbert Fuller murders.
God, yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think, I mean, do we know what happened after to people like Monks and Brown?
No, I'm not 100%. I think with Monks he was okay,
Mm,
and he carried on at Harvard. I'm not sure, but Brown, I think because it was sort of uncovered that he had some psychotic episodes.
mm.
I think any guess is as good, is as good as anyone else's. I believe he went back to sea as his only sort of only thing he could do. Um, but
God.
yeah, it's an issue. I mean, for the most part, I took the story from an article in the New York Times
Mm.
because, as I said, when I was reading about it, there was just so many different versions. So I kind of took that as a baseline. But yeah,
God.
I might have to find out what happened to Monks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I'll have to do some googling after this, to be honest. But it's yeah, just to find out. I mean, it's yeah. I think, like as you say, it must be. It's so difficult because there are so many areas that sound like they weren't properly explored or
Mm,
investigated, or and of course, with everything happening on a ship, it's your witnesses are are fairly limited, and
mm,
there's just so many elements. Really. I also find it interesting as well that I think it's amazing how often in these interesting stories around about that sort of time
mm.
that Teddy Roosevelt appears as well. I feel like he's in most really great North American stories from that period.
He is a bit, isn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah, he sort of does pop up. He's a busybody,
yeah,
is what we can take from that of, of Teddy
yeah.
Roosevelt.
He just sort
Busybody.
of turns up.
Yeah,
He just
yeah.
sort of turns up
Oh,
and yeah,
hi guys.
just tears everything apart.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, well, I read a book, and this is what I think.
God, interesting. Yeah, I mean, also, yeah, I think I'm also going to have to look up what happened to this inspector as well. It sounds like quite a character as well.
I
But
know he's almost sort of like the hero we didn't know didn't know we needed at this time, but also sort of not.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere someone had written that he thought of himself as a Sherlock Holmes sort of figure, and then obviously this written sort of more recently actually transpired to be a bit more of an Inspector Clouseau, but a really bad Inspector Clouseau, because
Oh
at
God.
least Clouseau always got his man in the end,
Yeah.
whereas
I suppose.
this guy didn't.
Yeah. I suppose it must have been incredibly frustrating, especially to have made the national papers and I suppose the international papers for probably all the wrong reasons
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah,
So I suppose he probably had something to prove
yeah, yeah,
by the time he got to the Herbert Fuller.
yeah, definitely.
Oh well, thank you very much for that. That was
No,
yeah,
you're
brilliant,
welcome.
really fascinating.
You're
Um,
welcome. Well done on hosting. Good
Oh,
job.
cheers. Thanks very much. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, we will wrap that up. So thank you very much again, Charlotte. That's fantastic. If anybody is interested, please keep a look out on our website for our online exhibitions, our stories, webinars, any upcoming events, and also on our social media platforms for some of the interesting content that we're providing all this month for maritime mysteries and chilling tales from the sea. And also for any research needs as well, if you're interested, go to our online catalogue. That's at hec.lrfoundation.org.uk. So thank you very much again, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining me. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.